The stagecoach lurched to a halt in the howling wind, and Julia Langford pressed her gloved hand against the frosted window, her heart sinking as she saw nothing but white emptiness stretching in every direction. She had traveled nearly 3,000 miles from Boston to become the bride of a rancher she had never met. And now the driver was shouting something about the horses, refusing to go farther into the blizzard that had descended upon the Oregon Territory like a woolen blanket dropped from heaven. It was December of 1878, and she was 23 years old, exhausted from weeks of travel, and terrified that she had made the worst mistake of her life. The driver's weathered face appeared at the window, snow clinging to his beard like fragments of torn cotton. "Miss, we cannot make it to Oregon City in this storm. The horses are spent and I can barely see 10 feet ahead. There is a ranch house about a quarter-mile back. We passed it just before the worst hit. I am going to have to ask you to walk there with me, or we will all freeze to death out here." Julia's stomach twisted. She had no choice, she knew that much. The cold was already seeping through the walls of the stagecoach, and her feet felt numb despite the layers of wool stockings beneath her traveling boots. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders and nodded, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The walk through the blizzard was the longest 15 minutes of Julia's life. The wind tore at her clothing, and the snow stung her face like tiny needles. She could barely make out the driver's form ahead of her, and twice she stumbled in drifts that came up past her knees. Her fingers were so cold they no longer hurt, which frightened her more than the pain had. Just when she thought she could not take another step, a dark shape materialized through the white curtain of snow. A ranch house, solid and square, with lamplight glowing weakly through the windows. The driver pounded on the door with his fist, the sound barely audible over the shrieking wind. Julia stood behind him, shivering so violently her teeth chattered. After what felt like an eternity, the door swung open, and warmth rushed out to meet them along with the silhouette of a tall man. "Get inside, both of you, before you freeze solid," the man said, his voice deep and commanding. He stepped back, and Julia stumbled across the threshold, her legs barely able to hold her weight. The driver followed, and the man pushed the door shut against the wind, throwing the bolt home with a solid thunk. Julia found herself standing in a large room that served as both kitchen and living area. A fire roared in the stone fireplace, and the warmth felt like a physical embrace. She was shaking so hard she could not speak, could not even look up at the man who had opened his home to them. "Sit her down by the fire," the man ordered the driver. "I will get blankets and something hot to drink." The driver guided Julia to a chair near the hearth, and she sank into it gratefully, holding her frozen hands toward the flames. She heard the man moving around behind her, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. When he returned, he draped a thick woolen blanket around her shoulders and pressed a tin cup into her trembling hands. "Coffee," he said. "Strong and hot. Drink it slowly." Julia raised the cup to her lips and took a small sip. The liquid burned going down, but it was the most welcome sensation she had ever felt. Slowly, painfully, feeling began to return to her fingers and toes. She blinked the snow from her eyelashes and finally looked up at her rescuer. He was perhaps 27 or 28 years old, with dark hair that fell nearly to his collar and eyes the color of a summer sky. His face was all hard planes and angles, weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw and a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. He wore simple clothes, denim trousers and a heavy wool shirt, and there was a quiet strength about him that made Julia feel safer than she had in weeks. "Name is Kieran Xavier," he said, looking between Julia and the driver. "I run this ranch alone. You are welcome to stay until the storm passes, though from the looks of it that will not be tonight." The driver removed his hat and brushed snow from it. "I am grateful, sir. Name is Tom Walker. This here is Miss Julia Langford. She is a mail-order bride, coming to Oregon City to marry Samuel Pritchard. We were making good time until this blizzard hit." Something flickered across Kieran's face at the mention of Samuel Pritchard's name, but it was gone so quickly Julia thought she might have imagined it. He turned his attention fully to her for the first time, and she felt herself flush under his steady gaze. "Samuel Pritchard," Kieran said slowly. "I know the man. His ranch is about 8 miles north of Oregon City, another 30 miles from here in good weather." Julia nodded, finding her voice at last. "I have been traveling for 5 weeks. We were supposed to arrive this evening. Mr. Pritchard is expecting me." "Mr. Pritchard will have to wait," Kieran said flatly. "No one is going anywhere in this storm. It looks like a 3-day blow at least, maybe longer. You will stay here until it is safe to travel." The driver looked relieved, but Julia felt a flutter of panic in her chest. She could not stay here, alone with a strange man for 3 days. It would be scandalous. But even as the thought formed, she realized how ridiculous it was. She would be dead if not for Kieran Xavier's hospitality, and propriety meant nothing when measured against survival. "I do not wish to impose," Julia said quietly. Kieran's eyes met hers, and for a moment something passed between them that Julia could not name. "You already said Mr. Pritchard is expecting you. He will understand when you arrive late. The storm is not your fault." He moved away then, busying himself with preparing food. The driver settled into another chair by the fire, and Julia sat in silence, watching Kieran work. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own space, pulling out bread and cold beef, slicing thick portions with a knife that gleamed in the firelight. He set plates on the table and gestured for them to eat. The meal was simple but hearty, and Julia realized she had not eaten since early morning. She ate slowly, stealing glances at Kieran when she thought he was not looking. He was different from the men she had known in Boston, quieter and more self-contained. There was something almost lonely about him, she thought, a solitary quality that matched this isolated ranch in the middle of nowhere. After they had eaten, Kieran showed the driver to a small room off the main living area where he could sleep. Then he turned to Julia, and she saw a hint of uncertainty in his expression for the first time. "I only have one other bedroom," he said. "You can have it. I will sleep out here by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Julia protested. "You have already done so much." "You can and you will," Kieran said firmly. "You are exhausted and you need proper rest. The bed has clean linens. I will not argue about this." Julia knew she should continue to protest, but the truth was she could barely keep her eyes open. The warmth of the room, the hot food, and the bone-deep exhaustion of weeks of travel were catching up with her all at once. She nodded and allowed Kieran to lead her to the bedroom. It was a simple room with whitewashed walls, a large bed covered with a patchwork quilt, and a washstand in the corner. A window looked out onto the storm, though all Julia could see was darkness and driving snow. "There is water in the pitcher if you need to wash," Kieran said from the doorway. "Sleep as long as you need. I will be up early to tend the stock, but help yourself to anything you need." "Thank you," Julia said softly. "You saved my life tonight." Kieran's expression softened slightly. Any man would have done the same, but Julia was not so sure about that. There was a kindness in Kieran Xavier that went beyond simple duty, a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. She watched him close the door, and then she was alone in the quiet room with only the sound of the wind outside and the faint crackling of the fire beyond the walls. She undressed down to her chemise and climbed beneath the quilts, too tired to even fully appreciate the comfort of the bed. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Kieran's blue eyes and the way he had looked at her when he said Samuel Pritchard's name. Julia woke to pale gray light filtering through the window and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was, and then memory came flooding back. The storm, the ranch, Kieran Xavier. She sat up slowly, her muscles stiff from travel and cold, and looked around the room. Someone had left a basin of warm water on the washstand and a clean towel beside it. The thoughtfulness of the gesture made her throat tighten. She washed quickly in the cold room and dressed in one of the 2 dresses she had packed in her small trunk, a simple blue wool that was practical rather than pretty. She braided her long brown hair and pinned it up, then took a deep breath and opened the bedroom door. Kieran was standing at the stove, stirring something in a large pot. He looked up when she entered, and Julia was startled by how different he looked in the morning light. The hardness was still there, but there was also a warmth in his eyes that had not been evident the night before. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Julia admitted. "Thank you for the warm water." "It is nothing." Kieran ladled oatmeal into a bowl and set it on the table. The driver already ate and went out to check on his horses in the barn. "The storm is still going strong. I do not think we will see a break today." Julia sat down and ate the oatmeal, which was thick and sweet with honey. Through the window she could see the world outside was still white, the snow falling so heavily it was like a solid wall. She shivered despite the warmth of the room. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, more to break the silence than anything. 5 years, Kieran said. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching her. "I bought the land and built the house myself. It is not much, but it is mine." "It seems like a lonely life," Julia said softly. Something flickered across Kieran's face. "It is, but it is better than what I left behind." Julia wanted to ask what he meant, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was old pain there, carefully buried but not entirely hidden. She changed the subject instead, asking about the ranch, the animals, the work. Kieran answered her questions in his quiet way, and slowly the tension in the room eased. As the day wore on, Julia found herself drawn to Kieran in a way she had not expected. He was different from Samuel Pritchard, whose letters had been correct and formal, full of practical details about his ranch and his expectations for a wife. Kieran was quieter, more introspective, but there was a depth to him that intrigued her. When he spoke, it was with careful consideration, and he listened to her in a way that made her feel truly heard. In the afternoon, Kieran went out to tend the animals, and Julia found herself restless in the warm house. She explored the main room, noting the simple furniture, the books on a shelf by the fireplace, the small details that spoke of a man living alone. There were no photographs, no mementos, nothing to suggest family or a past life. It was as if Kieran Xavier had sprung fully formed from the Oregon soil, with no history before this place. When he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots and shaking ice from his hair, Julia had started preparing the evening meal. She had found vegetables in the cold cellar and was chopping them for a stew, working from memory of the meals her mother used to make. "You do not have to do that," Kieran said, surprise evident in his voice. "I want to," Julia replied. "You have given me shelter and food. The least I can do is help with the cooking." Kieran hung up his coat and came to stand beside her at the counter. He was close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his clothes, smell the clean scent of snow and livestock. "You are a guest here. Guests should not have to work." Julia turned to look at him, and their eyes met. "I am a woman with nowhere else to go, stranded in a blizzard." "That makes me something more than a guest, I think." For a long moment, Kieran said nothing. Then, slowly, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger, more approachable. "You have a point," he said finally. "All right then. I will not argue, but only if you let me help." They worked together in companionable silence, Kieran adding wood to the stove while Julia seasoned the stew. The driver came in as the sun was setting, bringing a gust of cold air and snow with him. They ate together around the table, the three of them, and Julia was struck by how comfortable it felt, how natural. This was not her home, these were not her people, and yet for the first time since leaving Boston, she did not feel like a stranger in a strange land. That night, after the driver had retired and Kieran was banking the fire, Julia lingered in the main room. She did not want to go to bed yet, did not want to be alone with her thoughts. "Tell me about Samuel Pritchard," she said suddenly. Kieran's hand stilled on the poker. He did not turn around. "What do you want to know? You said you know him. What kind of man is he?" Kieran was silent for so long that Julia thought he might not answer. Then he straightened and turned to face her, his expression carefully neutral. "Samuel Pritchard is a successful rancher. He has a large spread, good stock, money in the bank. He is respected in Oregon City." "That is not what I asked," Julia said quietly. "I asked what kind of man he is." Kieran's jaw tightened. "He is hard, fair, I suppose, but hard. He expects a lot from the people who work for him, and he does not tolerate failure. He is 45 years old, a widower. His first wife died 10 years ago in childbirth, along with the baby. He never remarried, but I heard he was looking for a new wife to help run his household." Julia's hands twisted in her lap. Samuel's letters had not mentioned a first wife, had not mentioned much of anything personal at all. "Do you think he will be a good husband?" Kieran crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her. His eyes were intense, searching her face. "Why did you come here, Julia? Why did you agree to marry a man you have never met?" The question took her by surprise. She looked down at her hands, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. "I did not have a choice. My parents died last year within a month of each other. Influenza. I had no brothers, no other family. I was working as a seamstress, but I could barely afford my rent. When I saw Mr. Pritchard's advertisement in the newspaper, it seemed like an answer to prayer. A fresh start, a new life in the West. And now?" Kieran asked softly. Julia raised her eyes to his. "Now I am not so sure, but I have come all this way. I have to see it through." Something like pain flashed across Kieran's face. "You do not have to do anything. You always have a choice, Julia." "Do I?" she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I have no money, no skills beyond sewing, and I am stranded in Oregon territory. What choice do I have?" Kieran leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You could stay here." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Julia's heart began to pound. "What?" "You could stay here," Kieran repeated. "I have plenty of room. You could work for me, help with the cooking and the house. I would pay you wages enough to save up if you wanted to go somewhere else eventually. Or—" He trailed off, his eyes never leaving hers. "Or what?" Julia whispered. Kieran drew in a breath. "Or you could stay because you wanted to, not as hired help, as something more." Julia's mind was spinning. She had known this man for barely 24 hours, and yet here he was offering her a lifeline, an escape from a future that suddenly seemed less certain than it had when she was safe in Boston. But it was madness, wasn't it? To even consider such a thing. "I cannot," she said finally. "Mr. Pritchard is expecting me. He paid for my passage. I gave him my word." "Your word is not a chain," Kieran said fiercely. "You do not owe Samuel Pritchard your life." "Maybe not, but I owe him honesty." Julia stood up, her legs shaking. "I need to think. I need to sleep." "Can we talk about this tomorrow?" Kieran rose as well, and for a moment they stood facing each other in the firelight. "Of course," he said quietly. "I should not have spoken. Forget I said anything." But Julia knew she would not forget. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the storm rage outside, Kieran's words echoed in her mind. "You could stay here." As something more. What did that mean? Did he want her to be his wife, his companion? And more importantly, what did she want? She thought about Samuel Pritchard, a man she had never met, hard and exacting and 22 years her senior. Then she thought about Kieran Xavier, quiet and kind and so terribly alone in this isolated ranch. She thought about the way he had looked at her, the gentleness in his hands as he had draped the blanket around her shoulders, the smile that had transformed his face when she insisted on helping with dinner. And she thought about Boston, about the cold boarding house room where she had lived after her parents died, the endless hours bent over her sewing, the loneliness that had driven her to answer Samuel Pritchard's advertisement in the first place. She had wanted a home, she realized. Not just a husband, but a place where she belonged, where she was wanted. Could this ranch be that place? Could Kieran be that person? She did not know. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, she found herself hoping that the storm would last just a little longer, giving her more time to find out. The second day dawned cold and gray, the storm showing no signs of abating. Julia woke to the sound of Kieran moving around in the main room, and she dressed quickly, her heart fluttering with nervousness about facing him after their conversation the night before. But when she emerged from the bedroom, Kieran greeted her with the same quiet courtesy as before, giving no indication that anything had changed between them. He had prepared breakfast, and they ate together while the driver reported that one of his horses had developed a slight limp and would need rest before they could continue the journey. "That settles it then," Kieran said. "Even when the storm clears, you will need to wait at least another day before leaving. No point in pushing a lame horse." The driver agreed reluctantly, and Julia felt a confusing mix of relief and anxiety. More time. She had more time. After breakfast, the driver returned to the barn to tend the horses, and Julia found herself alone with Kieran again. The silence between them felt different now, charged with unspoken things. "I have mending to do," Kieran said finally. "If you meant what you said about wanting to help." Julia nodded, grateful for something to occupy her hands. Kieran brought out a basket of clothes that needed repair, shirts with torn seams and socks with holes, and Julia settled by the window with her needle and thread. Kieran sat across from her, working on a piece of leather tack that needed replacing, and they worked in comfortable quiet. As the hours passed, they began to talk, not about the future or Samuel Pritchard, but about smaller things. Kieran told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father's farm and how he had left home at 18 to seek his fortune in the West. He spoke of the gold rush in California, of years spent drifting from job to job, until finally settling in Oregon Territory and buying this land. Julia told him about Boston, about her parents and the little shop where her father had worked as a printer. She spoke of her mother's garden, of winter's ice skating on the common, of the books she had loved to read when she could afford them. As she talked, she realized how much she had missed having someone to talk to, really talk to, not just exchange pleasantries but share the substance of her life. "You miss it," Kieran observed. "Boston." Julia considered this, her needle pausing in its work. "I miss what it was. My parents, my childhood home. But the Boston I left behind, the one where I was alone and struggling, no, I do not miss that." "What do you want, Julia?" Kieran asked. His voice was soft, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made her breath catch. "If you could have anything, what would it be?" She looked down at the shirt in her lap, at her hands moving the needle through the fabric. "I want what everyone wants, I suppose. A home, family, to feel like I matter to someone. You matter. Julia's head snapped up. Kieran was looking at her with such raw honesty that it made her chest tight. You do not know me, she whispered. I know enough. Kieran set down the tack and leaned forward. I know you are brave to travel 3,000 miles alone. I know you are kind to worry about imposing when you were half frozen. I know you are strong to face your future with courage even when you are afraid. That is enough for me to know you matter. Tears stung Julia's eyes. No one had spoken to her like this in so long, with such conviction and care. Kieran, I meant what I said last night, he continued. You do not have to marry Samuel Pritchard. You could stay here with me. As what? Julia asked, her voice barely audible. As my wife, if you would have me. Kieran's hands clenched into fists on his knees. I know it is too fast. I know you barely know me. But I have been alone for 5 years, Julia, and in 2 days you have made this house feel like a home. I cannot let you go to Pritchard without at least telling you how I feel. Julia's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. I cannot give you an answer right now. This is all happening so fast. I know. Kieran stood up, running a hand through his hair. I am sorry. I am pushing you and I have no right. Take your time. Think about it. But know that the offer is real and it stands for as long as you need it to. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, clearly needing to escape the tension in the room. Julia watched him go, her mind reeling. 2 proposals in the span of 2 months, she thought wildly. One from a man she had never met, and one from a man she had known for 2 days. How was she supposed to make a decision that would shape the rest of her life? She set aside the mending and moved to the window, watching Kieran's figure disappear into the snow. The storm was finally starting to ease, she noticed. The wind had died down, and the snow was falling more gently now, in soft white flakes instead of the driving sheets of the past 2 days. By tomorrow, the weather might be clear enough to travel tomorrow. She might have to leave tomorrow. The thought filled her with a panic she had not expected. Leave this warm house, leave Kieran's quiet presence, leave the first place she had felt safe since her parents died. Go to Oregon City and marry Samuel Pritchard, a hard man who expected a wife to help run his household, not to be his partner or his companion. But was she really considering Kieran's offer? Was she really thinking about staying here, marrying a man she barely knew? Yes, she realized. She was. Because in 2 days, Kieran had shown her more genuine care and respect than Samuel Pritchard had in months of correspondence. Because when Kieran looked at her, she felt seen, truly seen, not just as a solution to a problem, but as a person of value. Because this house, isolated and simple as it was, felt more like home than anywhere she had been since her parents died. But there was still the question of duty, of honor. She had given her word to Samuel Pritchard. She had accepted his offer, let him pay for her passage. Did she have the right to break that promise? Julia paced the room, her thoughts tangled and confused. She wished she could talk to her mother, wished she had someone to advise her. But she was alone in this decision, just as she had been alone in so many things since becoming an orphan. When Kieran returned an hour later, snow dusted on his shoulders and his cheeks red from the cold, Julia had made up her mind. Or at least, she had decided what she needed to do next. I need to meet him, she said as soon as Kieran closed the door. He looked at her, his expression guarded. Pritchard? Yes. I cannot make a decision without meeting him, without seeing what kind of life I would have with him. It would not be fair to either of you. Kieran's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. You are right. That is fair. But I want you to know, Julia continued, her voice steady, that I am considering your offer, seriously considering it. You have given me more in 2 days than I ever expected to find here. Something like hope flickered across Kieran's face. Then I will wait. however long it takes." The rest of the day passed in a strange sort of limbo. They were both careful around each other, polite but distant, as if afraid that too much closeness would tip the balance one way or another. The driver came in for dinner, cheerful at the news that the storm was clearing, and they made plans to leave early the next morning if the weather held. That night, Julia lay awake in Kieran's bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine her future. One path led to Samuel Pritchard's ranch, to a life of hard work and practical partnership with a man who might never truly see her. The other led back to this house, to Kieran and his quiet strength, to a love that was just beginning to unfold. Which path was right? She did not know. But tomorrow would bring answers, one way or another. The morning of the third day dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue that hurt to look at. Julia packed her few belongings while Kieran and the driver prepared the horses. The lame animal had recovered enough to travel slowly, and the roads, though deep with snow, were passable. When it was time to leave, Julia stood in the doorway of the ranch house, looking back at the place that had sheltered her. Kieran stood a few feet away, his hands shoved in his pockets, his expression carefully blank. "Thank you," Julia said softly, "for everything." "You have nothing to thank me for." Kieran's voice was rough. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," Julia said firmly. "You did more than that. You gave me a choice. That is a gift beyond measure." Kieran's eyes met hers, and for a moment the careful distance between them crumbled. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and took her hand. His grip was warm and strong, and Julia felt tears prick her eyes. "Come back," Kieran said quietly. "No matter what you decide about Pritchard, come back so I know you are all right." Julia nodded, not trusting her voice. Then, before she could lose her courage, she rose on her toes and pressed a kiss to his cheek. Kieran's breath caught, and his hand tightened on hers for just a moment before he let her go. The journey to Oregon City took the better part of the day. The roads were difficult, and they had to stop frequently to rest the horses. Julia sat in the stagecoach, watching the snow-covered landscape roll past, her mind 1,000 miles away. She kept thinking about Kieran's face as she said goodbye, about the warmth of his hand, about the look in his eyes when he asked her to come back. They reached Oregon City as the sun was setting, painting the snow gold and pink. It was a small town, just a handful of buildings clustered around a main street, with houses and ranches spreading out into the surrounding hills. The driver took her to the hotel, where he said Samuel Pritchard had arranged for her to stay until they could be married. "Should I send word to Mr. Pritchard that you have arrived?" the driver asked. Julia hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, tell him I will meet him tomorrow morning." She spent a restless night in the hotel room, which was clean but impersonal. She kept thinking about the ranch house, about Kieran sleeping by the fire, about the decision that loomed before her. Morning came too quickly. Julia dressed in her best dress, a green wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and braided her hair carefully. She was just finishing when there was a knock at the door. "Miss Langford," a man's voice called. "I am Samuel Pritchard." Julia's hands trembled as she opened the door. The man standing in the hallway was tall and broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was dressed well, in a suit that spoke of money, and his eyes were a cold, assessing brown. "Mr. Pritchard," Julia said, dropping a small curtsy. "I am pleased to finally meet you." Samuel Pritchard looked her up and down, his expression unchanging. "You are thinner than I expected from your photograph, but you will do. I trust your journey was uneventful." Julia blinked, taken aback by his brusque manner. "There was a storm. We had to take shelter at a ranch for a few days. I heard about the blizzard. No matter, you are here now." Samuel gestured down the hallway. "Come, We will have breakfast and discuss the arrangements for the wedding." Julia followed him down to the hotel dining room, her stomach churning. Samuel pulled out her chair with perfunctory courtesy and then seated himself across from her. He ordered for both of them without asking what she wanted, and then fixed her with that same assessing stare. "I run a large operation," he said without preamble. 5,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, a dozen horses. I employ 6 men year-round, more during roundup and branding. My house is large and requires significant upkeep. I expect my wife to manage the household, oversee the cooking and cleaning, and entertain when necessary. I do business with important men in the territory, and I need a wife who can present well." Julia nodded slowly, her appetite vanishing. "I understand. I am not a difficult man," Samuel continued, "but I expect obedience and hard work. My first wife understood that. I hope you will as well." "What happened to your first wife?" Julia asked quietly. Samuel's expression darkened. "She died in childbirth. It was a long time ago. I do not speak of it." The food arrived and they ate in silence. Julia watched Samuel, noting the way he ate with mechanical efficiency, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room as if looking for threats or opportunities. There was no warmth in him, no softness. He was exactly as Kieran had described. Hard, fair perhaps, but utterly without tenderness. When the meal was finished, Samuel pushed back his chair. "I have taken the liberty of arranging for the Reverend to perform the ceremony tomorrow afternoon. That will give you time to prepare yourself. I will collect you at 2 o'clock. "Tomorrow," Julia's voice came out as a squeak. "But I just arrived. I thought we would have time to get to know each other." Samuel frowned. "What is there to know? We have corresponded for months. You agreed to be my wife. I see no reason for delay." Julia's hands clenched in her lap. "Mr. Pritchard, I need more time. This is a significant decision. I would like at least a week to consider." "Consider what?" Samuel's voice turned sharp. "You gave your word, Miss Langford. I paid for your passage. I expect you to honor your commitment." "I will honor my commitment," Julia said, her own voice hardening. "But I will not be rushed into marriage with a man I have just met. 1 week. That is not unreasonable." Samuel stared at her for a long moment, and Julia had the distinct impression he was not used to being contradicted. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Very well. 1 week. I will return next Tuesday to collect you for the wedding. Do not make me regret my generosity, Miss Langford." He stood and left without another word, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Julia sat alone at the table, her heart pounding. That, she thought, had not gone well. She spent the rest of the day walking around Oregon City, trying to clear her head. It was a bustling little town, full of miners and ranchers and families trying to make a life in the Oregon Territory. People were friendly enough, tipping their hats and bidding her good morning, but Julia felt isolated in a way she had not at Kieran's ranch. By evening, she had made her decision. She returned to the hotel, paid for another night, and asked the clerk where she might hire a horse. "You planning to ride somewhere, miss?" the clerk asked, surprised. "I need to return to a ranch about 30 miles south of here," Julia said. "The Xavier place. Do you know it?" the clerk nodded. "Sure, I know Kieran Xavier. Good man, keeps to himself mostly. You can rent a horse from the livery down the street, but I would not recommend traveling alone, miss. It is not safe for a woman." "I will be fine," Julia said firmly. "Thank you for your help." She spent a sleepless night in the hotel, her mind made up but her nerves jangling. Early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, she packed her belongings, rented a sturdy mare from the livery, and set out on the road back to Kieran's ranch. The journey took most of the day. Julia had never ridden such a distance alone, and by the time the ranch house came into view, her legs were shaking and her back ached. But her heart was singing. She was going home. Not to Boston, not to Samuel Pritchard's cold efficiency, but to the place where she had felt safe and valued and seen. She dismounted in front of the house, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. The door opened before she could knock, and Kieran stood there, his eyes wide with shock. "Julia, what are you doing here? What happened?" "I met him," Julia said, her voice trembling with exhaustion and emotion. "I met Samuel Pritchard." Kieran's expression grew guarded. And I do not want to marry him." The words came out in a rush. "He is exactly as you described, Kieran. Hard and cold and utterly without warmth. He does not want a wife, he wants an employee, someone to manage his household and present well to his business associates. There was no kindness in him, no softness. I cannot spend my life with a man like that." Kieran was staring at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "What are you saying?" Julia took a shaky breath. "I am saying yes to your offer if it still stands. I want to stay here with you, as your wife." For a moment Kieran did not move. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming him. He stepped forward and took her hands in his grip warm and strong and achingly familiar. "You are already home," Kieran said softly. "You have been since the moment you walked through that door. You just needed to realize it." Julia felt tears streaming down her face, tears of relief and joy and overwhelming gratitude. I know that now." Kieran pulled her into his arms, and Julia buried her face in his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other, the world falling away until there was nothing but the two of them and the promise of a future together. "We should go inside," Kieran said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "You are shaking." He was right. The adrenaline that had carried her through the long ride was fading, and Julia was suddenly aware of how cold and exhausted she was. Kieran led her into the house, settled her by the fire, and pressed a cup of hot coffee into her hands. "What about Pritchard?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "He will not be happy about this. I know." Julia took a sip of the coffee, feeling warmth spread through her. "I will write to him. I will return the money he paid for my passage somehow. I will make it right." "We will make it right," Kieran corrected gently. "You are not alone in this anymore, Julia. Whatever comes, we face it together." Julia's throat tightened. She reached out and took Kieran's hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Together," she agreed. They sat in front of the fire, talking late into the night. There was so much to discuss, so many plans to make. Kieran wanted to marry her as soon as possible, to make their union official before Samuel Pritchard could cause trouble. Julia agreed, though she was nervous about the speed of it all. "Are you sure about this?" she asked him as the fire burned low. "You barely know me. What if I am not what you hoped?" Kieran turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious. "I know everything I need to know. You are brave and kind and strong. You have a good heart and a sharp mind. That is enough for me. The rest we will learn together." "I do not know how to be a rancher's wife," Julia confessed. "I grew up in the city. I do not know about cattle or horses or any of this." "I will teach you," Kieran said simply. "And you will teach me things too, I am sure. We will figure it out together." Julia leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling a peace settle over her that she had not felt in years. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. The next morning, Kieran rode into Oregon City to find the Reverend and arrange for a wedding ceremony. Julia stayed at the ranch, using the time to write a letter to Samuel Pritchard. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done, explaining that she could not marry him, that she had found someone else. She was honest about her reasons, but also apologetic, promising to repay the money he had spent on her passage. When Kieran returned that evening, he brought news that the Reverend would come to the ranch in 2 days to perform the ceremony. He also brought supplies from the general store, including fabric for a new dress, which he presented to Julia with an almost shy expression. "For the wedding," he said, "if you want to make something special." Julia took the fabric, a soft cream-colored cotton, and felt tears prick her eyes again. "Thank you. This is perfect." She spent the next 2 days sewing furiously, creating a simple but elegant dress for her wedding. Kieran, meanwhile, worked on improving the house, adding small touches that made it feel more like a home. He brought in wildflowers that he had somehow found blooming in a sheltered spot despite the recent snow, and arranged them in a jar on the table. He cleaned and polished everything until the house gleamed. On the morning of the wedding, Julia woke with butterflies in her stomach. She dressed carefully in her new cream dress, braiding her hair and pinning it up with the few hairpins she owned. When she looked at herself in the small mirror in the bedroom, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked happy, she realized. Genuinely, radiantly happy. The Reverend arrived at noon, along with 2 ranchers from neighboring properties who would serve as witnesses. They were gruff but kind men, clearly fond of Kieran, and they treated Julia with warm respect. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Kieran stood beside Julia in front of the fireplace, wearing his best clothes, his hand warm and steady as it held hers. When the Reverend asked if he would take Julia as his wife, Kieran's voice rang out clear and sure. "I will." And when it was Julia's turn, she looked into Kieran's blue eyes and spoke the words that would bind her life to his. "I will." Kieran kissed her as the Reverend pronounced them married, a gentle, lingering kiss that spoke of promise and new beginnings. The witnesses cheered, and Julia found herself laughing, her heart so full she thought it might burst. They celebrated with a simple meal that Julia had prepared, and the neighbors regaled them with stories of life in the Oregon Territory. It was warm and joyful, and Julia felt welcomed in a way she never had in Boston. These people might be rough around the edges, but they had good hearts. After the guests had left, Julia and Kieran found themselves alone for the first time as husband and wife. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and they stood together at the window, watching the light fade over the snow-covered landscape. "Are you happy?" Kieran asked softly. Julia turned to look at him, this man who had offered her shelter in a storm and ended up offering her so much more. "I am happier than I have been in years. You gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go. You saw me when I felt invisible. How could I be anything but happy?" Kieran cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to make you this happy every single day." He kissed her then, deeper this time, and Julia felt something unfurl in her chest, something warm and bright and full of hope. This was love, she realized. Not the practical arrangement she had sought with Samuel Pritchard, but real, genuine love. The kind that grew from respect and kindness, and the deep recognition of 2 souls finding their match. That night, as they lay together in the bed that was now theirs, Kieran held her close and whispered promises in the dark. Promises of love and partnership, of building a life together, of facing whatever challenges came their way as a team. And Julia, safe in his arms, whispered her own promises back. The next morning, reality came calling in the form of a rider from Oregon City. Samuel Pritchard had received Julia's letter, and he was furious. He was threatening legal action, claiming that Julia had violated their contract and demanding compensation. Kieran's face grew hard as he read the message. "I will go to town and speak with him. This needs to be settled." "I am coming with you," Julia said firmly. "This is my responsibility." They rode to Oregon City together, arriving at Samuel Pritchard's hotel in the early afternoon. Samuel was waiting for them in the lobby, his face like thunder. He looked between Julia and Kieran, his lip curling in disgust. "So it is true," he spat. "You threw me over for him. A nobody with a nothing ranch." "Mr. Pritchard," Julia said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I apologize for any inconvenience I have caused you, but I cannot marry a man I do not love. I will repay you for the money you spent on my passage. It may take time, but I will repay every cent." "You think money solves this?" Samuel's voice rose, drawing stares from the other people in the lobby. "You made me look like a fool. You gave your word. And you wanted a servant, not a wife," Julia shot back, her temper flaring. "You never once asked what I wanted or how I felt. You just expected me to fall in line with your plans." Samuel took a step forward, his fists clenched, and Kieran immediately moved between him and Julia, his posture protective. "That is enough," Kieran said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "You will not speak to my wife that way. Julia has offered to repay you. That is fair and honorable. Accept it and move on." Samuel glared at Kieran, and for a moment Julia thought he might actually throw a punch. But then he seemed to get control of himself. He straightened his coat and fixed them both with a cold stare. "Fine. I will expect payment within 6 months. If I do not receive it, I will pursue legal action. Now get out of my sight, both of you." Kieran took Julia's arm and led her out of the hotel. She was shaking, partly from anger and partly from relief. It was over. She had faced Samuel Pritchard and held her ground, and now she was truly free. "Are you all right?" Kieran asked as they mounted their horses. "I am fine," Julia said, and she realized she meant it. "Actually, I feel better than fine. I feel strong." Kieran smiled at her, that rare, transforming smile that made her heart skip. "You are strong. You always have been." They rode back to the ranch in companionable silence, and as the house came into view, Julia felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was her home now. This was where she belonged. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Julia's life. She and Kieran fell into an easy rhythm, working together to run the ranch and build their life. Julia learned to cook over the wood stove, to churn butter, to tend the chickens that Kieran bought for her. Kieran taught her to ride properly, to help with the cattle, to read the weather and the land. But it was not all work. They talked for hours, sharing their histories and their dreams. They read together by the fire in the evenings, Kieran's arm around Julia's shoulders as she leaned against him. They laughed and argued and slowly learned each other's rhythms and quirks. And they loved each other, deeply and completely. Kieran was a tender, attentive husband, always concerned for Julia's comfort and happiness. Julia, in turn, brought warmth and light into Kieran's previously solitary existence. The loneliness that had haunted him for 5 years melted away under her care. Winter gave way to spring, and the Oregon landscape came alive with color and life. Julia planted a garden behind the house, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the rich soil. She took pride in her growing skills, in the way she was becoming a true partner to Kieran in running the ranch. 6 months after their wedding, Julia sat down with Kieran to discuss their finances. They had been careful with their money, saving every penny they could, and Julia was determined to keep her promise to Samuel Pritchard. "We have enough," Kieran said, looking over the figures Julia had carefully recorded. "We can pay him back and still have a cushion for emergencies." Julia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "Are you sure? I do not want to put us in a difficult position." "I am sure." Kieran took her hand across the table. "This is important to you, and what is important to you is important to me. We will pay the debt and be done with it." They rode to Oregon City the next day and delivered the money to Samuel Pritchard personally. He counted it with cold efficiency and then nodded curtly. "We are square," he said. "Do not expect me to wish you well." "I do not," Julia said evenly, "but I thank you for accepting the payment." "Goodbye, Mr. Pritchard." As they rode away from Oregon City, Julia felt lighter than she had in months. The last tie to her old life was severed. She was truly free now, free to build a future with Kieran without any shadows from the past. Summer brought long, golden days of hard work and deeper contentment. Julia's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables for their table and extras to sell in town. Kieran's cattle thrived, and he was able to hire a seasonal hand to help with the work. Their little ranch was prospering, and with it, their marriage. In August, Julia began to suspect that she might be pregnant. She waited a few weeks to be sure, and then one evening as they sat together watching the sunset, she told Kieran her news. His face went through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, joy, fear, and then a fierce protectiveness that made Julia's eyes sting with tears. "Are you certain?" he asked, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "As certain as I can be," Julia said softly. "The baby should come in early spring." Kieran pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she were made of glass. "I am going to be a father," he whispered, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a child. Are you happy?" Julia asked, though she could already see the answer in his eyes. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Kieran said. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You have given me everything, Julia. A home, a family, a reason to wake up smiling every morning. How could I be anything but overjoyed?" The months of Julia's pregnancy passed in a haze of preparation and anticipation. Kieran built a cradle with his own hands, sanding and polishing the wood until it gleamed. Julia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart swelling with love for the child she had not yet met. The neighboring ranchers and their wives rallied around them, offering advice and support and promising to help when the baby came. Winter returned to the Oregon Territory, blanketing the land in snow once more. As Julia's body grew round with their child, she often thought back to that night almost a year ago when she had arrived at this ranch, frozen and desperate and certain her life was over. How wrong she had been. Her life had not ended that night. It had begun. In March of 1879, on a night when the wind howled and snow fell softly outside, Julia went into labor. Kieran sent for the midwife from the nearest ranch, and then he stayed by Julia's side through the long, difficult hours, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. "You are doing so well," he told her, wiping the sweat from her brow. "Just a little longer, my brave girl, just a little longer." And then, as dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, their son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry that made both his parents laugh through their tears. The midwife cleaned him and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Julia's arms. "He is perfect," Julia whispered, looking down at the tiny face, the miniature fingers that curled around her thumb. Kieran sat beside her on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, the other hand gently stroking their son's downy head. "He is a miracle," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You are both miracles." They named him William, after Kieran's father, and he became the center of their world. Kieran was a devoted father, patient and gentle despite his rough exterior. Julia marveled at the sight of her strong, stoic husband cradling their tiny son, singing off key lullabies and making silly faces to coax out a smile. As William grew from infant to toddler, the Xavier Ranch continued to thrive. Kieran expanded his herd and improved the house, adding a second bedroom for William and a covered porch where they could sit on summer evenings. Julia's garden grew larger each year, and she began selling her surplus produce in Oregon City, earning her own money and taking pride in her contribution to their finances. They faced challenges, of course. There were hard winters when the snow came early and stayed late, threatening their livestock. There were droughts in summer that turned the grass brown and made water scarce. There were illnesses and injuries, the daily struggles of frontier life. But they faced everything together, and their love only deepened with each trial overcome. When William was 3 years old, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1882 they welcomed a daughter into their family. They named her Catherine, after Julia's mother, and she had her father's blue eyes and her mother's dark hair. Kieran held his daughter with the same wonder he had shown when William was born, and Julia watched him with a full heart. This man, she thought, who had been so lonely when she met him, now had a house full of love and laughter. And she had a home, a real home, not just a place to live, but a place where she belonged, where she was cherished. The years rolled by like the seasons, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. William grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the ways of the ranch. Catherine was bright and curious, always asking questions and exploring her world with fearless enthusiasm. Julia and Kieran raised them with love and firm guidance, teaching them the value of hard work and the importance of kindness. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kieran surprised Julia with a trip to Oregon City. He had arranged for the neighbors to watch the children, and he took Julia to the hotel where she had first met Samuel Pritchard all those years ago. They had dinner in the dining room, and afterward, Kieran presented her with a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, a simple gold band set with a small sapphire. "I never gave you a proper engagement ring," Kieran said, his voice soft. "I want you to have this now as a symbol of what you mean to me." Julia's eyes filled with tears as Kieran slipped the ring onto her finger, next to the plain gold band she had worn since their wedding. "It is beautiful," she whispered, "but you did not have to do this. I have everything I need." "I know," Kieran said, taking her hands in his, "but I wanted to. 10 years ago, you walked into my life in a blizzard, and you have been blessing me every day since. This is just a small token of my love for you." Julia stood and wrapped her arms around her husband, holding him tight. "I love you," she said fiercely. "I loved you then, though I did not know it yet, and I love you now more than I can ever say." "I know," Kieran said, his lips against her hair. "I feel the same." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the same hotel where Julia's life had nearly taken such a different turn. She thought about Samuel Pritchard, wondered briefly what had become of him. But then Kieran was leading her to the door, and the thought drifted away. The past did not matter, only the present, only this moment and all the moments that would come after. As they rode home under a sky full of stars, Julia reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had left Boston as a desperate young woman with nowhere else to go, agreeing to marry a man she had never met. She had arrived in a blizzard, frozen and afraid, certain her life was over. But Kieran had opened his door and his heart. He had seen her, truly seen her, and offered her not just shelter but a home. "You are already home," he had said, and those words had changed everything. And he had been right. From that first night, huddled by his fire with a blanket around her shoulders, she had been home. She just had not known it yet. But now, 10 years later, with 2 beautiful children and a love that had only grown stronger with time, she understood the truth of those words. Home was not a place. It was a person. It was the way Kieran looked at her in the morning, sleep rumpled and smiling. It was the sound of her children's laughter filling the house. It was the land they worked together, the life they had built with their own hands. It was knowing that no matter what challenges came, they would face them together. They reached the ranch house as the moon was rising, casting silver light over the snow-covered fields. The house was dark, the children asleep at the neighbors, and for once they had the place to themselves. Kieran helped Julia down from her horse and then pulled her close, his arms warm around her. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Xavier," he said softly. "Happy anniversary," Julia replied and kissed him under the moonlight. The next 15 years brought more changes. William grew into a strong young man who took pride in helping his father run the ranch. Catherine became a skilled rider and a talented artist, filling notebooks with sketches of the Oregon landscape. In 1887, Julia gave birth to another son, whom they named James, and 3 years later, a second daughter, Margaret, completed their family. The house rang with the sounds of childhood, laughter and arguments, running feet and slamming doors, bedtime stories and morning chaos. Julia and Kieran navigated the challenges of raising 4 children with the same partnership that had seen them through everything else. They were united in their values, firm but loving, and their children thrived under their care. The ranch prospered too. Kieran's reputation as an honest, hard-working rancher spread throughout the territory, and he began to take on larger contracts, supplying beef to the growing towns and cities of Oregon. Julia's garden became famous in its own right, and she often had to hire help during harvest season to keep up with demand. But through all the success and growth, Julia and Kieran never lost sight of what mattered most: each other and their family. Every evening, no matter how busy the day had been, they made time to sit together and talk. They made sure to celebrate small moments as well as large ones, to notice the beauty in ordinary days. As their children grew older and began to make their own way in the world, Julia and Kieran found themselves coming full circle. William, at 25, married a girl from Oregon City and took over the day-to-day running of the ranch. Catherine, at 23, moved to Portland to study art, her talent recognized by teachers who encouraged her to pursue her passion. James and Margaret were still at home, but they were growing up fast, already talking about their own futures. One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside just as it had all those years ago, Julia and Kieran sat by the fire in the house that had become so much more than shelter. They were older now, with silver threading through their hair and lines on their faces earned by years of laughter and hard work. But their love was as strong as ever, perhaps even stronger for having weathered so many seasons together. "You ever regret it?" Kieran asked suddenly. "Choosing this life, choosing me?" Julia looked at him in surprise. "Never, not once. Why would you ask that?" Kieran shrugged, gazing into the fire. "I just wonder sometimes if you think about how different your life might have been. If you had married Pritchard, you would have had wealth, status, an easier life perhaps." Julia reached over and took his hand, waiting until he looked at her. "I would have had none of the things that matter. I would have had a house but not a home, security but not love. A husband but not a partner. You gave me everything that truly matters, Kieran. You gave me a life worth living." Kieran's eyes were bright in the firelight. "You gave me the same, more than the same. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You taught me how to truly live." Julia moved from her chair to sit beside him, tucking herself against his side as she had done 1,000 times before. "We taught each other," she said softly. "That is what love is, I think. 2 people choosing each other every day, building a life together piece by piece." "I choose you," Kieran said, kissing the top of her head. "Every day for the rest of my life I choose you." "And I choose you," Julia replied. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low, both lost in memories of the journey that had brought them here. Julia thought about that desperate young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach into a blizzard, frightened and alone. She wished she could go back and tell her younger self that everything would be all right, better than all right. That the storm would pass and the sun would shine again, and she would find a love beyond anything she had ever imagined. But perhaps it was better that she had not known. Perhaps the fear and uncertainty had made the joy and security that much sweeter. Perhaps she had needed to be lost before she could truly appreciate being found. The years continued to pass, bringing grandchildren and new adventures. William and his wife had 3 children who loved to visit the ranch, filling it once again with young voices and energy. Catherine married a fellow artist in Portland and had twin daughters. James took a job with the railroad, and Margaret became a teacher in Oregon City. Julia and Kieran, now in their 60s, settled into the comfortable rhythms of later life. They still worked the ranch, though William had taken over most of the heavy labor. They spent their days tending Julia's garden, maintaining the house, and enjoying visits from their children and grandchildren. On a bright spring morning in 1905, nearly 30 years after their wedding, Julia stood in her garden watching Kieran play with their grandchildren. He was older now, his dark hair turned mostly gray, his movements slower than they once were. But his eyes still lit up with joy, and his laugh still made her heart skip a beat. One of the grandchildren, a little girl of 5, tugged on Julia's skirt. "Grandma, tell us the story again, about how you and Grandpa met." Julia smiled and gathered the children around her. It was a story they never tired of hearing, and she never tired of telling. "It was a long time ago," she began. "In the winter of 1878, I was traveling to Oregon City to marry a man I had never met. But then a terrible blizzard came, and the stagecoach could not go any farther. We had to seek shelter, and your grandfather opened his door to us." "And you fell in love right away?" the little girl asked, her eyes wide. Julia laughed softly. "Not right away, but I knew there was something special about him. He was kind when he did not have to be. He saw me as a person, not just a problem to solve, and when it came time for me to leave, he gave me a choice. He told me I could stay if I wanted to." "And you stayed," one of the older boys said, "because you loved him." "I stayed because I saw a chance for real happiness," Julia said. "Love came quickly after that. Your grandfather made it very easy to love him." Kieran had walked over during the story, and now he slipped an arm around Julia's waist. "She forgets to mention that she rode 30 miles on her own to come back to me," he said to the children. "She was brave and strong, and I knew from the moment she returned that I would spend the rest of my life trying to deserve her." "You deserve me," Julia said firmly. "We deserve each other." They looked at each other, and in that moment the years fell away. Julia saw the young man who had offered her shelter, who had looked at her with such hope and tenderness. And Kieran saw the young woman who had stumbled into his life and transformed it completely. "Tell them what you said," one of the grandchildren urged. "Tell them the special words." Kieran smiled and turned to Julia, cupping her face in his weathered hands. "You are already home," he said softly, repeating the words he had spoken so many years ago. "You have been since the moment you walked through that door." "And I always will be," Julia replied, her voice thick with emotion. The grandchildren cheered, and Kieran kissed Julia gently, a kiss that held 3 decades of love and partnership and unwavering commitment. When they pulled apart, Julia saw tears in his eyes to match her own. "Best decision I ever made," Kieran whispered, "asking you to stay." "Best decision I ever made," Julia replied, "was saying yes." They stood together in the garden, surrounded by their grandchildren and the life they had built together. The sun was warm on Julia's face, and the air smelled of spring flowers and fresh earth. In the distance, she could see the house that had sheltered her from a blizzard and become her home. She could see the fields where Kieran had taught her to ride, the barn where they had worked side by side, the fence line they had mended together countless times. This was her life, she thought with deep satisfaction. Not the life she had planned when she left Boston, not the life she had expected when she agreed to marry Samuel Pritchard, but a better life than she ever could have imagined, a life full of love and purpose and belonging. Years later, when Julia was 70 and Kieran was 74, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. The ranch house was bursting with family, with laughter and stories, and the warmth of multiple generations gathered together. William stood up to make a toast, his own hair now graying at the temples. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day. Who showed us that home is not a place, but the people you choose to build a life with. We are all here because 50 years ago, a blizzard brought a brave young woman to this ranch, and a good man had the wisdom to ask her to stay." To Mom and Dad, the room chorused, and Julia felt tears streaming down her face. Kieran squeezed her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. "We did all right, didn't we?" he said quietly, just for her ears. "We did more than all right," Julia replied. "We did beautifully." That night, after the family had settled down and the house was finally quiet, Julia and Kieran sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cool evening air. The stars were brilliant overhead, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. 50 years, Kieran mused. "It seems like both a lifetime and no time at all." "I know what you mean," Julia said. "I still remember that first night so clearly. The cold, the fear, the way you looked when you opened the door. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen," Kieran said. "Snow in your hair, frozen to the bone, eyes like a frightened deer, and so brave," Julia laughed softly. "I did not feel brave, I felt terrified." "Bravery is not the absence of fear," Kieran said. "It is acting despite the fear, and you did that. You chose your own path instead of the safe, expected one. That took real courage." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Julia thought about all the moments that had brought them to this one. The proposal by the fire, the confrontation with Samuel Pritchard, their wedding day, the births of their children, the challenges and triumphs of building a life together. Every moment had mattered, every choice had led them here. "You know what I am most grateful for?" Julia asked finally. "What?" "That you gave me a choice. That you did not pressure me or try to make me stay. You just offered and then you let me decide. That gift of choice, of agency over my own life, that meant everything." Kieran turned to look at her, his blue eyes still clear despite his age. "You deserve to choose. Every woman deserves to choose her own path." "Not every man would think that way," Julia said. "Especially not in 1878. You were ahead of your time." "Maybe," Kieran said. "Or maybe I just knew that love has to be freely given or it is not really love at all. I wanted you to stay, but I wanted you to want it too. Otherwise, what would have been the point?" Julia leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "I am so glad I came back to you, so glad I chose this life." "So am I," Kieran said softly. "Every single day, I am grateful." They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, then climbed into the bed they had shared for 50 years. As Julia drifted off to sleep, safe in Kieran's arms, she thought about the young woman she had been and the life that lay ahead of her. She hoped that woman could see this moment, could know that the fear and uncertainty had been worth it, that the risk she had taken had paid off beyond her wildest dreams. Julia and Kieran Xavier lived another decade together, their love a testament to the power of choosing each other every single day. They saw their family grow and flourish, their grandchildren have children of their own. They watched the Oregon Territory change and modernize, though the ranch remained largely the same, a pocket of history in a rapidly advancing world. When Kieran passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 84, Julia grieved deeply, but without regret. They had lived a full, rich life together, and she had been blessed with 55 years as his wife. She continued on at the ranch, supported by her children and surrounded by family, and she spoke of Kieran every day with love and joy rather than sorrow. When Julia herself passed away 5 years later, at the age of 80, she was laid to rest beside Kieran on a hillside overlooking the ranch. Their children commissioned a headstone that bore both their names and a simple inscription. Together, they were home. And so the story that began in a blizzard, with a frightened young woman and a lonely rancher, ended in peace and love, the legacy of their partnership living on through generations. The ranch still stands, run now by great-grandchildren who honor the memory of their ancestors, by working the land with care and raising their own families with love. And sometimes, on winter evenings when snow falls softly and the wind howls around the eaves, people say you can still feel their presence in that house. The warmth of the fire that welcomed a stranger, the comfort of a home freely offered and gratefully accepted, the enduring power of a love that began with a simple truth. You are already home. You have been since the moment you walked through that door. It was a truth that had changed 2 lives and created a legacy that would endure for generations. A reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with certainty, but with a choice made in faith. A choice to stay when you could have gone, to trust when you had every reason to fear, to build a home not on expectations or obligations but on mutual respect, genuine partnership, and a love that grew deeper with every passing year. Julia Langford Xavier had arrived in Oregon Territory with nowhere else to go, running from loneliness and toward an uncertain future. But she found something better than what she had sought. She found a man who saw her worth, a place that welcomed her spirit, and a love that transformed both their lives. She found home, and in finding home she found herself.